Hello and welcome to another episode of the Statesman Talk. Today we are being joined by Sriram Balasubramanian, who is a renowned economist, columnist, as well as an author. His two recent books, Dharmanomics and Cotilionomics, have been uh, hugely appreciated by economists, historians, authors, as well as people who are working currently in global economics. Sriram, first, let's start with your current book, Dharmanomics, so that people get to know a bit about what you write about and your thought process.
Namaste, and thank you for inviting me for this podcast, and thanks for your kind words as well. I would like to sort of begin, this discussion with some background to my research. Besides being a macroeconomist, focusing on international macro, there are some areas of interest of mine which sort of have been nourished over the last, I would say, a decade. And that's predominantly linked to two research questions. The first question is related to economic history, which is basically what is the indigenous economic model that Bharat had through its economic history, and what is sort of the indigenous model that we can also present to the rest of the world, based on our history and what are some of the elements of it. So that's one key area of research which I focus on. And the second area of research is again on the role of cultural norms, narratives, and its influence in economic decision making, and how much our day-to-day lifestyles or our way of life impacts not just our socio political sphere, but also has a profound impact on our economic choices, both at the individual level as well as the corporate level. So these two are sort of big picture questions which I have been pursuing as part of my research for almost a decade now. While I was researching, to understand more about our economic history, I didn't really find too much material. While Angus Madison, the late Angus Madison, economic historian, he had produced a data set arguing that for about 1,000 years, or at least post CE, Common Era, India and China were the top countries in terms of GDP and GDP per capita over till almost the 17th century CE.
For the Britishers, right up till
That's
then.
right. That's right. That's right. Till almost, I would say, the Vijayanagar Empire, put it that way, in the south. So essentially, what this sort of triggered me to think about, because I come from the south, so I was born in Chennai, and I've seen marvelous temples and architectural sort of marvels like Brihadishwara Temple in Tanjavur, which is built in about 11th century CE, which are all engineering marvels even today. So intuitively, I had a sense that all of these things in terms of prosperity, even though I sort of disagree with how we interpret Madison's work, that's a side story. But broadly, what I'm trying to say is that there had to be some level of an economic framework that facilitated this prosperity. It's not like it's not like this prosperity came out of thin air or merely out of population. Uh, so that's when I chanced upon the Arthashastra, which is a third century BCE text written by Kautilya or Chanakya. Much of the discussion around the Arthashastra is on the political side, the Chanakya Niti and the foreign policy angle of Kautilya. But it's called the Arthashastra for a reason. So its primary focus is economics and wealth creation. So based on this, spending a few years on this, I derive a framework called Dharmic capitalism, based on the idea of dharma. Dharma is a multi-dimensional word. I define it through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and a social and economic harmony, just engaging with the rest of the world. And I map these three sort of definitions of dharma to the broader themes of what I call Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism, which is basically a state which is rule enforcing but doesn't micromanage, which means it has strict regulations but doesn't really micromanage individual transactions in a simple way. Second, wealth creation through a global outlook. the fact that we were engaging with the rest of the world on commerce and trade was the norm for thousands of years in this country. The post independent till 1990 phenomena was an aberration at best, and much of the our past has been engaging with the world. So the wealth creation via global outlook, and lastly, the third pillar is sustainable growth through the prism of responsibilities, familial, societal, and environmental responsibilities. So this structure is what I call the framework that I had in Kautilyanomics, and I sort of contextualize it to each of the thematic elements of the macroeconomy today, say trade, say inequality, labor contracts, sustainability, and things like that. And I give Kautilya's ideas which are relevant today in each of these chapters. So
Okay,
that is
I'm gonna interrupt you right here because it's a bit dense
sure,
for
sure.
so let's break it down a bit. Going backwards, going back to when you said that you want to also see economics through the prism of culture. So do you think that's specific to every country, or you think it's unique, especially more pronounced in a country like India, which is so ancient and so culturally diverse? And
Right.
why is it so important to see economics through culture, especially in the Indian context?
Right. So I think that's a very important question. So this is it's very important to see that through this context because research on say culture, answering your first question, research on cultural norms and narratives has been done globally for a long period of time.
Yeah,
Gary Becker,
to study economics.
correct, by economists, right? For
Yeah,
example, Gary Becker, who won the Nobel Prize in the 70s, in the 70s, he had done some work on discrimination and the role of, these norms in the United States, for example, right? And also more recently, George Eccleston, who won the Nobel in 2001 for asymmetric information, has an entire stream that talks about identity economics, basically norms and narratives and the role of identity, especially in the West and societies in the West. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of thinkers in the Anglo-Saxon world as well as the non-Asian world have done a lot of work on this. Whereas in India, the work is limited, but on the other hand, the role of culture is very significant in
hmm,
economic decision making. So I'll give you an example, right, to again simplify. If you really take the UPI transactions in this current year, the highest amount, one of the highest of UPI transactions happened during the week of Diwali, right? On an average through the year, right? So you find that a lot of the discretionary expenditure, we have discretionary and non-discretionary. Non-discretionary is basically essential expenditure, right? Like you go to a hospital, you have a health checkup, you have a house, essential things that we spend on, right? Uh, and discretionary is non-essential things, right? Much of the discretionary expenditure is driven a lot by cultural entities in terms of festivities, in terms of our behavioral choices. How do we make decisions, both at the individual level, like I mentioned, an example of
yeah,
UPI transactions, and even at the corporate level, right? If you really think about it, if you take the top 10 businesses in India today, right? Or top 10, 15 businesses in India, most of them are family driven businesses, right? Family in the sense that, they might be publicly listed, but there's a core sort of familial unit which runs these businesses. And most of these familial units make economic choices or business choices, not just on complete rationality,
yeah.
but on a wide range of things, including their cultural norms, their background, and things like that. So, for example, right, when Mukesh Ambani was talking to Jensen Huang, during a recent summit, AI summit, he talks about how Diwali is the new year, and he begins a lot of activities, during the new year, and why that's a very important thing even for the stock market, and how Mumbai functions, for example, right? So what I'm trying to say is the role of culture and economic activities is not something that we are creating. It's already there.
It's already there.
Life has a profound impact on economic choices, and that's how it's been, for a long time. It's just that I'm trying to, or rather through some of this research, I'm trying to flesh it out even more so that there is a conscious attempt to acknowledge and then use some of these elements for better policy outcomes. So, answering your question, the role of culture plays a role in everywhere around the world.
Yeah.
But in Asian societies, especially in Indian society, it plays a far higher role as well in day-to-day economic choices.
Okay, and then let's talk about the terms that you were talking about,
Right.
right? What is dharmic capitalism?
Right.
That's something that you've talked about.
Right. So the idea of dharma through Kautilya's prism is that he sees, I mean, in a conventional macro economy, you have the state and you have the market, right? You have the state, which taxes you, which invest in infrastructure if there's a downturn. You have a state which does a variety of things to stimulate the economy, right? Similarly, you have the market, marketplace where you compete, firms become bigger and they generate employment opportunities and things like that, right? So Kautilya views dharma to be something beyond this binary of the state of the market, which provides a foundation. So again, in simple terms, say, for example, there is corruption at the state, right? A more sort of a dharmic society reduces the propensity of being corrupt, according to Kautilya, for stakeholders in the state. Similarly, if there is moral hazard, say in the markets where say a big player, a big company sort of runs over a small company, uh,
Yeah.
uh, then a more sort of a dharmic approach to these things, creates a more equitable platform. So through this prism, I define again dharma has multiple meanings, which I showcase in the book. It's a multi-dimensional word, very difficult to translate. But purely for economic policy construct, I talk about ethics, I talk about responsibilities, and I talk about harmony. Harmony both socially as well as economically with the rest of the world. So these are the three, definitions of dharma, and these are mapped. For example, ethics is mapped to clean institutions, clean leadership, a clean business environment, for example, ease of business. And then, for example, harmony is mapped to social harmony as well as engaging with the rest of the world. And then responsibilities is, say, familial responsibility, societal responsibilities, environmental responsibilities. And all of these, branches map onto the three pillars which I mentioned, which is the role of the state, which is
Yeah.
basically enforcing but doesn't micromanage, which means, again, in simple terms, let's say me and both of us are trading some goods, right? Let's say, there are some handicrafts that you want to sell to me or I want to sell to you, right? Kautilya's approach would be that there are certain defined regulations of how we want to trade, right? And if you violate these regulations, then the punishment is will be given, right? Whatever the violation is. But Kautilya doesn't micromanage the type of product we are trading, the color of the product that we are trading, the quantity of the product that we are trading, and all these things, right? Kautilya's approach is to stay back from all that, but ensure that the parameters are set and the regulations are set and they're enforced. So and the next part of it is again wealth creation with a global outlook, which means having an approach to engage with the rest of the world. Exchange products, exchange ideas, exchange thought processes, and sort of enabling that. And lastly, sustainability, which I mentioned, right? Because of responsibilities, Kautilya mentions the need to have a conscious attempt to be responsible about the environment, responsible about the society around you, your neighborhood around you, and the need to sort of be inclusive and things like that. So I've tried to simplify it a bit more, but this is where the broader architecture would be of this dharmic capitalism.
So this is what, uh, besides this sustainable and equitable prosperity, what are the other, say, top five things that you can tell our audiences, that Kautilya talked about?
Yeah. So in terms of, let's say I'll give top five practical examples, right? That way it's easier for people to relate, right?
Mhm.
So one of the ideas that Kautilya proposes is the idea of flexible minimum wage, right? I mean, we've all heard of minimum wages, right? It's part of a
Yeah.
lot of our discussions. Like in the United States, for example, a $15 an hour minimum wage is something that people want to aspire towards. Um, but what Kautilya argues is that this minimum wage is not a constant number. This is a number that has to be flexible depending on the macro environment. For example, say $15 at 7% inflation is very different to $15 at say 2% inflation, right? The real wages are different. So Kautilya argues that this minimum wage needs to be flexible so that every say a year or 6 months or whatever it is, you need to revisit this number, right? And then
Okay.
and
It
then
can go
how do
up and down too.
correct, and then adapt it, right? So that's one of the
Hmm.
another area where again where Kautilya adds a lot of merit is the idea of labor contracts, right? I mean, even today, if you look at India, just go to a construction site, in Delhi or Calcutta or any other place, right? And you walk in and look at the daily wage laborers.
Yeah.
Uh, if you go and ask them if there is any contract that you have, right, just for your employment, right? How much in hours or how
Yeah.
most of them wouldn't have a contract, right? They might
Yeah.
have formal understanding, right? Kautilya argues that, even I'm talking about thousands of years back, he says that the employer has to have at least a minimum basic contract with any laborer so that it tells them, how long they're going to work, what is the broad nature of work, and how often what is the length of the work and things like that, right? There has to be a template, which he argues, which needs to be put by the employer, and the employee could request them to do it because it's their sort of right to
Yeah.
request them to do it. So the idea of labor contracts and then empowering the poor through having enforcing labor contracts is another very important, I would say, value addition, right? The third one is, we have heard of direct benefit transfers a lot, right? I mean,
Yeah.
now you transfer money directly to people,
Yeah.
uh, some targeted transfers, right? Rather than a UBI. UBI is universal basic income, is something you give everyone, right? Rather than that, a direct benefit transfer is for a certain section of people, you target some amount
Yeah.
of money and then you give
And
it.
now it gives them directly. Yeah.
Correct. So this is something again Kautilya advocates, where he feels that, remember, right? Kautilya was a political advisor, right? He was an
That's
economist.
strategic.
Correct. So
Yeah.
his goal was also political success, right? Which
Hmm.
means that, either inherently he wanted the poor people to be supported by a variety of schemes so
Hmm.
that they are not disenchanted. Because often the mass population is the poor people, right? Generally in society, the richer ones are not the majority, right?
Yeah.
So even in that sense, so he advocates for a targeted transfer, which means he would, in all likelihood, give for the poor a certain section of people the basic needs that are required, right? And then give it targetedly in an efficient manner. So that's another this thing I would say. And lastly, another interesting idea which I would say Kautilya was ahead of his time, was this entire concept to debt resolution, right? We talk about the IBC, the insolvency bankruptcy code that we have, for example, in
Yeah.
2016 that was advocated. So, how do you sort of deal with situations where companies and entities go through sort of a debt restructuring because they are bankrupt and things like that, right? So Kautilya again gives this Samadhana Dandaved principle on how do you resolve such sort of disputes in a calibrated manner, which involves negotiation, which involves after
Punishment.
time.
Yeah.
Exactly. So how do you do that? He provides sort of a structure to it, right?
Hmm.
And lastly, I think what is most important to understand is wealth creation was not a taboo in this land at all, right? We are talking about third century BC. Even then, there are instances where traders, people who pursued wealth
Yes,
creation.
they pursued wealth in a normal manner. Yeah.
Correct. And they were encouraged, and they were, there was no sort of taboo, even debt financing, right? Where you
Mhm.
sort of take a loan and then
Yeah.
finance your operation. Even that was normal as long as it was within certain limitations. So these are, some of the ideas I think, which could be relevant today.
You have talked about the inequality of consumption in one of your podcasts. Why do you think that's so relevant to India? And you've said that how it affects economic migration in India. And do you think we should address it more vigorously?
Yeah, see, inequality of consumption again is a sort of a broad topic, right? I mean, it could be a factor because of inequality of opportunity,
Mm.
because you don't get necessary opportunity in particular
Yeah.
areas. It
Yeah.
could be also because of inequality of income as well, because when people get less amount of income, then their ability to consume is also lesser, right?
Mm.
So I think how some of these ideas can help us, in my view, is that it provides a first principles approach. I think that's how one needs to look at some of these, ancient ideas, because obviously, I think both of us can agree that not everything from the past is applicable today. So there will be definitely things, that are not applicable today that we can't implement today for a variety of reasons, right? But having said that, that doesn't mean that one doesn't study the past, because the past provides you a template, especially in some of these kingdoms, and that you talk about, for almost thousands of years of a particular sort of economic, thinking, which has been there in various iterations, across these kingdoms, and most importantly, irrespective of
Stood the
who's
test of time. This stood the
correct,
test of
correct,
time.
correct, and irrespective of who was in political power, right?
Hmm.
All these kingdoms were all at war with each other, right? Consistently, right? They were fighting smaller wars, bigger wars, whatever that you want to call it, right?
Hmm.
But there was an underlying principle of this, right? I think what is the essence of this longevity is something that we can sort of apply and use in some of these principles. So probably I can extend a
Yeah.
bit of Dharmanomics, which will give you a bit flavor on this. But anyways, that we will probably address it in the next question.
And why do you think that is? Like Arthashastra was one of the first, one of the first few treaties, financial treaties written. Why do you think it stood the test of time?
I think, see, the, there are a couple of interesting things, right? The Arthashastra was not discovered in Bharat till about 1915. That's when Shama Shastri, he was basically a registrar, a librarian at the Mysore Oriental Library in Mysore. And a Tanjavur, a Pandit based in Tanjavur, came and gave him this manuscript, which he translated to be one of the first translations of the Arthashastra. So what I'm trying to say is, in popular parlance, the Arthashastra was, at least the manuscript was not in popular circulation for a long period of time, right?
Hmm.
But yet its ideas, its thought processes, you could see it in not just in India. You can even see it in Cambodia. You can see it in Vietnam. You could see it even in some Java and other places, right? Where inscriptions talk about how some of these kings, inspired, or at least references to Arthashastra, right?
Yeah.
Which means there is an inherent, at least from word of mouth, there is a transfer of a lot of this knowledge which happened. So that, so much so that he even traveled, across, oceans as well. So I think one of the reasons perhaps is that, the text itself is a very dense, it covers multiple areas, right? It's like a manual.
Hmm.
And there are many chapters in it, and there are a lot of ideas and themes which are cross-sectional, which means there could be a chapter on law and order, but that law and order can also tell you how to do debt resolution, for example, right? So, there's this idea of Matsya Nyaya, which is like avoiding Matsya Nyaya, which is basically a big fish eating a small fish. How do you
Hmm.
sort of avoid that? But that can be also viewed through the prism of inequality, right? Where you reduce the gap between the rich and the poor as well. So a lot of cross-sectional themes that you see in the text. And the fact that it gives you a variety of ideas, I think, could be also one of the reasons why it survived, because, people can use different ideas at different points of time in their, socio-political changes
Yeah.
in that milieu. And most importantly, I think the idea of dharma as a sort of a pillar, as a foundational pillar, I think resonated with many of these places, and it resonated with their way of lives. I think that is an important buy-in that people in societies had, and that could be why I think it has withstood the test of time.
Okay. Shriram, take us through your life a bit, where you were born, your childhood, your later years in Colombia. And, how do you think these kind of varied experiences have shaped up your intrinsic thought process? You grew up in a joint family, I believe. You've written about that as well.
That's
Yeah.
right. I mean, I was born in Chennai, and
Mm.
did my initial part of schooling in Chennai.
Mhm.
Uh, my mother's family was an extended joint family,
Yeah.
which had at the minimum, say, 13, 14 members in one house. So it was a, very nostalgic, but a very sort of, close-knit familial environment, through which, I learned, I would say, quite a few things. And then I spent some time in Singapore. I mean, I did my Second half of my high school in Singapore. My parents have been there for some time, and then I did my engineering in India, and then I did a couple of my postgraduate in the United States. Of course, with Columbia as well, where I specialized in microeconomics. But I think so basically I come with a sort of a diverse background. So, and I've been at the multilateral setup for about 10 plus years as well. So a diverse background, which is multinational, I would say, in a sense, multilingual, and also from a policy background, which gives an
Yeah.
overarching perspective on all these things. And I think that's where perhaps I've gained the ability to critically think and analyze a wide range of issues. Because when you look at other countries, right? I mean, you look at the Chinese, for example. How did the Chinese sort of, overcome almost, the greatest reduction in poverty in the last, say, 35, 40 years?
Yeah.
Similarly, for the Japanese, for example, what are some of the Japanese, tools of economic, progress and things like that? One common thread that I see even in capitalism, modern day capitalism essentially is an offshoot of the Protestant ethic, right? So there is an inspiration for all of these sort of, superpowers or superpower wannabes, put it that way, which people seek from elements of their past. And a lot of it is even in contemporary policy. A lot of these ideas sort of resonate. I think that's a very, very interesting sort of, I would say, observation and also inspiration, because that basically says that unless you sort of take a self introspection, given that each country, each domain is so diverse and complex, you would it's difficult to have sustainable economic ideas, which has a buy-in from people, right? Essentially, an extension of the two research questions I mentioned earlier is also this question of what I define as way of life, right? And policy making, right?
Yeah.
Often what happens is, especially in post-independent India, you had a situation where a bunch of people in Delhi would conceptualize policy and thrust that policy across rest of India, right? And and
Blanket.
and these people, well-intentioned though, definitely, but they come from a very narrow prism, narrow
Yeah.
background.
From a privileged background. Yeah.
Yeah, privileged in some form, yes, and then highly educated, especially from abroad.
Hmm.
Uh, and their realities with what Bharat actually is quite a gap, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is, I am also seeing that if policy making is aligned to the way of life, then it makes policy making far more effective.
I think that's one of the reasons why China has done better than India in the last few years, is because they've been more true to their indigenous culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And see, if you take the prime minister itself, right? One of the reasons why people find it difficult, especially economists, to understand the prime minister is because he comes from a unique experience, right, of life experience, right? Which means
Yeah. Experience.
he's been through, I would say 15 years, 15 years as a pracharak, and then 15 years as a political aspirant, and then as 15 years as chief minister and then prime minister, right? But beyond all this, there's a very important point that he is probably one of the only prime ministers
Yeah.
besides Lal Bahadur Shastri to have experienced poverty,
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
So experiencing poverty means that he, the fact that he can understand the importance of a light in a house, the importance of an Ujjwal Yojana for a common person, right? It's such a sort of a liberating feeling. But more importantly, it's also that, there is a way of life element to this as well. So, for example, again, simplifying it, if you
Yeah.
take Swachh Bharat initiative and the success of it, in rural areas is far more successful than urban areas, right? That's how I think a lot of the data alludes to that, as well as my anecdotal observations also allude to that. Um, One of the reasons I see this is that this dharmic definition of saucham, which is one of the definitions of dharma, which is basically cleanliness. All of us are sort of try our best to be clean in our houses. Only thing when you come to the neighborhood, we lose the collective sense of being
I
clean.
know.
Uh,
Yeah.
but in rural areas, I think this became a movement because it's almost taking this saucham, this consciousness, through the machinery of the prime minister and his popularity and things like that, and taking it to your neighborhood. So much so that they see this as a collective purpose for them to be part of, right?
Yeah.
Sort of a dharmic purpose for them to be part of. So much so that if you again go to rural areas, especially villages, except for the market bazaar street,
Mm,
most of the other streets are fairly clean, much cleaner than before.
mm,
I think there has been a conscious attempt where it's almost become autopilot, right?
mm.
This is an example of policy aligning to the way of life, right? There is already a way of life that is happening, which is an extension of many thousands of years.
Yeah.
And if policy making can align to it, then
Yeah.
instead of being 80% effective, you'll get 95% effectiveness.
Okay, and my last question would be, your works have been admired by, as I said earlier, economists, authors, historians. Uh, how difficult it is to create a work, this kind of work which is so well researched, so well documented, as well as, do you think uh, it's because it was already there and you just like simplified it for current generations, or there's more that goes into it?
Yeah, uh, thanks for mentioning that. I mean, that's good to hear, but it's a lot of work, right? I spent almost 8 9 years of my life, not full time, but still, I mean, equivalent to full time that way in terms of the work
Mm.
on deciphering all this, right?
Yeah.
Because most of all these things were abstract thoughts. All I'm trying to do is to
Yeah,
put
a lot of people
various
quote Chanakya and quote, but they don't, I don't think a lot of us have actually read what the
correct.
other
So
right, yeah.
correct. So what I try to do is to invest a lot of time in all these things and then create themes, thematic themes, and then bring together a framework. Because for a common person, especially the policymaker, without a construct, without a theory, it's very difficult for them to simulate and investigate in action, right? So that's what even my book Dharmanomics
Hmm.
also deals with the common era kingdoms, the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas,
Yeah.
and all Southeast Asia. It talks about three things. One is this Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism. Another is the Dharmic ecosystem, which is basically temple-driven economies
Hmm.
in the villages, even in those times. And then the idea of Srini Dharma, which is again corporate guilds, how they played a role of multinational corporations and their role in financing a lot of these things, right?
Hmm.
So what this tries to establish is a qualitative time series, right? Over this period of time, that there are various iterations of this dharmic model, and then linking it to our way of life, which is because it's an outcome of the way of life, right? So what I'm trying to say is it's a lot of rigorous work and thought process, but I think it is trying to not. I mean, I wouldn't say there's anything new in this, but it's consolidation of a lot of these ideas, and then having a consistent framework, which is
Yeah.
new, and then relating it to the current reality of what we are, and sort of urging people to look at at least economic policy and economics from a different lens, because eventually when you're going to Viksit Bharat, which is one of our goals, there are two areas which will be central to that possibility of a success. One is the informal economy, most of which revolves around trust, community, family, and things like that. And two is the entire manifestation of this way of life and how it changes in the process of the Viksit Bharat, right? If you're not able to sort of understand these two pillars, it'll be difficult for us to assess how as we move forward. So I think while a lot of this initially I was doing it because of my passion and how I wanted to bring out this message, but I'm glad that a lot of people are receptive, and that's why you see the blurbs for these books are from prominent policymakers who had decades of experience.
Are
And
they being used as a template for any policy making currently?
I think people are, at least from my interactions and from the feedback that I'm getting, people are, thinking about such things like, in a more concrete manner. And I think that's where the success of some of these work is, because you eventually want, we all want the best for the country.
Yeah.
And we want
Yeah.
to sort of nudge people in a particular direction.
Yeah.
So they also give this perspective. And I think there is traction and there is appreciation. So that is good. I think as a researcher, that's what one's aim is. You try to be as rigorous as possible and try to, do the best that you can. And the success of these books, I mean, the first Dharmanomics was a national bestseller, and this book is also doing quite well. I think that's testimony to the interest that people have on such subjects as well.
And I believe you're going to Calcutta now to talk about the book.
That's right. I'm there's an event in ORF on 28th and in Calcutta, and I really look forward to it. And it's a place that I've really wanted to always come and meet people. So I look forward.
And then back to the States.
No, I have another event, couple of events in Hyderabad and a few other places, and in Chennai,
Mhm.
and back to the States. It's been very tight, but yeah,
We hope to meet you in person when you're here next.
sure,
And all the best for your upcoming work and great work again. Thank
sure.
you so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it very much.